The screams echoed through the grand dining room as blood pooled on the white tablecloth. Master Hathaway clutched his throat, his wife collapsed beside him, and their children writhed in agony. In the kitchen doorway stood Mercy Allen, the enslaved woman who had served them faithfully for 15 years, watching as the ground glass she had mixed into their evening bread tore through their bodies. She turned without a word, walked through the back door into the Alabama night, and vanished forever. What drove a woman known for her gentle nature to commit such a horrific act, and what became of her after she disappeared into the darkness? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The year was 1847, and the Hathaway plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of rich Alabama soil. Cotton fields rolled like white-capped waves under the blazing sun, and the mansion house stood tall with its gleaming white columns and wraparound porches. It was a picture of Southern prosperity, built on the backs of 43 enslaved souls who worked from dawn until dusk in conditions that would break most spirits. Mercy Allen had been born on this very land 28 years earlier, her first breath drawn in the cramped quarters behind the big house where the domestic slaves lived. Her mother, Ruth, had been the head cook before her, and from the time Mercy could walk, she was at her mother's side in the kitchen, learning the intricate dance of preparing meals for the Hathaway family. The kitchen was a world unto itself, with its massive hearth, cast iron pots that could feed 20 people, and shelves lined with spices that Master Hathaway imported from distant lands. Ruth had taught her daughter more than just cooking. She had passed down the wisdom of survival, the art of becoming invisible when necessary, and the delicate balance required to navigate the treacherous waters of plantation life. "Keep your head down, child," Ruth would whisper, as they kneaded dough in the pre-dawn darkness. "Keep your thoughts to yourself, and never let them see what you're truly thinking." It was advice that had kept Ruth alive for 43 years, and she prayed it would do the same for Mercy. Master Jefferson Hathaway was a man of medium height, with graying temples and cold blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He had inherited the plantation from his father and had expanded it considerably over the years, purchasing more land and more slaves with each successful cotton harvest. His wife, Cordelia, was a delicate woman with pale skin and nervous hands who spent her days embroidering or playing piano in the parlor. She rarely spoke to the slaves directly, preferring to communicate through her husband or the overseer. The Hathaway children, twin boys named Charles and Robert, were 13 years old in 1847. They had grown up believing that the enslaved people on their plantation were less than human, a belief reinforced by their father's casual cruelty and their mother's indifference. They delighted in ordering the slaves around, threatening punishments for imagined slights, and treating them as if they were furniture that could be moved or discarded at will. Mercy had watched these children grow from babies to young men, had prepared countless meals for them, had nursed them through fevers and scraped knees when their parents were too busy or too disinterested to care. Despite their treatment of her, she had felt something almost maternal toward them in their younger years, though that feeling had curdled as they matured into cruel replicas of their father. The kitchen, where Mercy spent most of her waking hours, was located in a separate building behind the main house, connected by a covered walkway. This was a common design in southern plantations, as it kept the heat and smoke of cooking away from the family's living spaces. The kitchen building also housed the laundry and various storage rooms, and it was here that Mercy had spent virtually her entire life. She knew every stone in the hearth, every crack in the wooden floor, every shadow cast by the hanging pots and pans. Her daily routine began before sunrise, when she would light the fires and begin preparing breakfast for the family. The Hathaways expected their meals to be elaborate affairs, even for breakfast. There would be fresh biscuits with butter and honey, scrambled eggs, bacon or sausage, grits with cream, and fresh fruit when it was in season. Everything had to be perfectly prepared and served at the exact temperature the family preferred. After breakfast was cleared, Mercy would begin planning and preparing the midday meal, which was typically the largest of the day. Dinner in the evening was usually lighter, but still required careful attention to detail. In addition to cooking, Mercy was responsible for managing the household's food stores, planning menus based on what was available from the plantation's gardens and livestock, and supervising the younger enslaved people who helped in the kitchen and served at table. It was a position of relative authority among the enslaved population, but it also came with tremendous pressure and scrutiny from the family. The overseer, a brutish man named Silas Crawford, was particularly watchful of Mercy's activities. Crawford was suspicious of any slave who held a position of responsibility, believing that such roles gave them ideas above their station. He made frequent visits to the kitchen, ostensibly to check on food stores or discuss meal planning with Master Hathaway. But Mercy knew he was really looking for any excuse to assert his authority or find fault with her work. Crawford was a man in his 40s with weathered skin and hard eyes, and he carried a leather whip that he wasn't hesitant to use. He'd been hired by Master Hathaway 5 years earlier after the previous overseer had died of fever, and he had immediately set about establishing his dominance through fear and violence. The enslaved population lived in constant terror of his unpredictable rages and harsh punishments, and many bore scars from encounters with his whip. For 15 years, Mercy had navigated this dangerous world with the skill her mother had taught her. She had kept her head down, done her work with quiet efficiency, and avoided drawing attention to herself. She had watched friends and family members sold away, beaten, or worse, and had learned to bury her emotions deep inside where they couldn't be seen or used against her. The kitchen had become her sanctuary, the one place where she felt some measure of control, where her skills were valued even if she herself was not. But something had begun to change in Mercy during the summer of 1847. It started small, just a growing sense of unease and resentment that she tried to push down. The Hathaway family had always been demanding and sometimes cruel, but their behavior seemed to be escalating. Master Hathaway had begun drinking more heavily, and his temper had grown shorter and more violent. He had recently sold 3 slaves to pay gambling debts, separating families without regard for the emotional cost. One of those sold was Mary, a young woman who had been like a sister to Mercy since childhood. The day Mary was taken away in chains, Mercy had stood at the kitchen window and watched the wagon disappear down the dusty road. She had wanted to scream, to run after it, to do something, anything, to stop what was happening. Instead, she had turned back to her work, preparing the evening meal as if nothing had changed, as if her world hadn't just been torn apart again. But something inside her had shifted that day. A small crack in the careful control she had maintained for so many years. The crack had grown wider as the weeks passed. Charles and Robert had been particularly cruel recently, seeming to take pleasure in tormenting the younger slaves. Just the week before, they had forced a 10-year-old boy named David to carry them around the yard on his hands and knees, lipping him with a switch when he collapsed from exhaustion. When Mercy had tried to intervene, bringing the boy water and attempting to tend his wounds, Master Hathaway had struck her across the face and warned her never to interfere with his son's entertainment again. Cordelia Hathaway had watched this scene from the porch without expression, sipping her lemonade as if the suffering before her was no more concerning than the weather. It was this casual indifference to human pain that perhaps affected Mercy most deeply. She could understand hatred, even cruelty born of anger, but the cold dismissal of their humanity as something less than animal was harder to bear. The breaking point had come 3 days earlier, on a Tuesday evening in late September. Mercy had been in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard raised voices from the main house. Curious and concerned, she had crept closer to listen. Through the open window of Master Hathaway's study, she could hear him talking with Crawford about plans to sell more slaves to cover his mounting debts. Her name was mentioned, along with several others, and she realized with growing horror that she was to be sold to a plantation in Mississippi within the month. The thought of being torn away from everything she had ever known, of being sold to strangers who might be even crueler than the Hathaways, filled her with a despair so profound she could barely breathe. This was the only home she had ever known, these people the only family she had left. The idea of starting over somewhere else, of learning new routines and new dangers, of being completely alone in the world, was almost unbearable. But it was what she heard next that transformed her despair into something darker. Master Hathaway was laughing as he told Crawford about the high price he expected to get for her, joking about how the buyer in Mississippi had a reputation for working his female slaves, especially hard in ways that went beyond mere labor. The implications were clear, and the casual way they discussed her future degradation made her stomach turn with rage and revulsion. That night, Mercy had lain awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and feeling something cold and hard crystallizing in her chest. For 28 years, she had endured every indignity, every cruelty, every loss, telling herself that survival was worth any price. She had been the perfect slave, obedient and invisible, never causing trouble or drawing unwanted attention. And for what? To be sold like livestock to men who would use her body as well as her labor, to spend whatever years remained to her in conditions that might make her current suffering seem mild by comparison. The next morning, Mercy had gone about her duties with the same efficiency as always, but something fundamental had changed. As she prepared breakfast, she found herself studying the family in a new way, noticing details she had previously ignored. She observed how Master Hathaway's hands shook slightly when he reached for his coffee, a sign of the liver damage caused by his heavy drinking. She noted the way Cordelia barely touched her food, picking at it with the listless appetite of someone slowly wasting away. She watched Charles and Robert shovel down their eggs and bacon with the thoughtless hunger of growing boys who had never known want or fear. These people who had controlled every aspect of her life suddenly seemed fragile, vulnerable in ways she had never considered before. They depended on her completely for their daily nourishment, trusting her to prepare their food with the same care and attention she had always shown. It was a trust they took for granted, never considering that the woman who fed them might have her own thoughts, her own breaking point, her own capacity for action. The idea came to her slowly, growing from a whisper in the back of her mind to a roar that drowned out every other thought. She tried to push it away, telling herself it was madness, that such thoughts would only lead to her destruction and possibly the destruction of every enslaved person on the plantation. But the idea persisted, taking root and growing stronger with each passing hour. On the morning of the third day, Mercy made her decision. She would not be sold to Mississippi. She would not spend the rest of her life being used and degraded by strangers. She would take control of her own fate, even if it meant embracing damnation. As she lit the fires in the kitchen and began her morning routine, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The constant tension that had plagued her for months was gone, replaced by a cold clarity of purpose that was almost peaceful. The day passed like any other on the surface. Mercy prepared breakfast and served it to the family, cleaned up afterward, and began planning the evening meal. She tended the kitchen garden, checking on the vegetables that would accompany the main course. She supervised the younger slaves as they cleaned the dining room and polished the silver. To any observer, she was the same reliable, efficient woman she had always been. But inside, she was preparing for war. The weapon she chose was elegantly simple. In the storage room adjacent to the kitchen, there were several old glass bottles that had once contained expensive wines imported from France. Master Hathaway had drunk their contents and kept the bottles as trophies of his refined taste. They had been sitting on a shelf for months, collecting dust and serving no purpose beyond displaying their owner's perceived sophistication. Mercy selected the largest of these bottles, a dark green creation with an elaborate shape that had once held a rare Burgundy. She carried it to the back corner of the storage room, where the sound would be muffled, and wrapped it in an old flour sack. With a heavy iron pot, she struck it repeatedly until it shattered into hundreds of sharp fragments. Then, using a smaller pot as a mortar, she began the painstaking process of grinding the glass into an even finer powder. It took her nearly an hour to reduce the bottle to a powder, fine enough for her purposes. The work was methodical, almost meditative, and with each strike of her makeshift pestle, she felt her resolve hardening further. This was not a decision made in the heat of passion or temporary madness. This was a calculated choice, made with full understanding of the consequences for herself and others. When the glass was ground to her satisfaction, she carefully poured the powder into a small cloth bag and hid it beneath sacks of flour. Then she cleaned up any evidence of what she had done, sweeping away every visible fragment and returning the pots to their proper places. To anyone who might check, it would appear that she had simply been organizing the storage room, a task that was part of her regular duties. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange state of suspended time. Mercy went through the motions of her regular routine, but every action felt significant, as if she were performing a ritual whose meaning extended far beyond the simple preparation of a meal. She selected vegetables from the garden with unusual care, choosing the finest specimens, as if she were preparing a feast rather than an execution. She checked the smokehouse and selected a ham that had been curing for months, its surface dark and fragrant with the herbs she had rubbed into it herself. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plantation grounds, Mercy began the final preparations for the evening meal. The menu would be simple but elegant, the kind of meal the Hathaway family expected after a day of conducting their various business affairs. There would be ham glazed with honey and mustard, vegetables from the garden prepared with butter and herbs, and fresh bread still warm from the oven. It was the bread that would carry her message. Mercy had been baking bread for the Hathaway table for 15 years, and she knew exactly how they liked it. Golden brown on the outside, soft and white on the inside, with just a hint of sweetness from the molasses she added to the dough. They consumed it eagerly at every meal, slathering it with butter and honey, never questioning its source or considering the hands that had made it possible. Today's bread would be different. As she mixed the flour and water, added the yeast and molasses, Mercy felt a strange detachment from her own actions. Her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of years of experience, but her mind seemed to float above the scene, observing rather than participating. She kneaded the dough with the same care she always showed, working it until it reached the perfect consistency for rising. Then, when the moment came to add the final ingredient, she opened a small cloth bag and poured the ground glass into the mixture. The powder disappeared completely into the pale dough, invisible to the eye and, she hoped, to the taste. She kneaded it in thoroughly, ensuring even distribution throughout the mass. The glass was ground so fine that it felt like nothing more than gritty flour between her fingers, but she knew that when consumed, it would act like countless tiny knives, slicing through the delicate tissues of the throat and stomach. After shaping the loaves and setting them aside to rise, Mercy continued with the rest of the meal preparation. The normalcy of these other tasks created a surreal contrast with what she had just done. She glazed the ham with the same attention to detail she always showed, seasoned the vegetables with herbs from her own garden, and set the table with the family's finest china and crystal. Everything had to be perfect for what might well be their final meal together. As the bread rose and then baked in the oven, filling the kitchen with its familiar, comforting aroma, Mercy found herself thinking about her mother. Ruth had died 3 years earlier, worn out by decades of unrelenting labor and the constant stress of plantation life. In her final days, she had spoken often about freedom, about a place beyond the reach of masters and overseers where enslaved people could live as human beings rather than property. "Someday, child," Ruth had whispered with her last breath, "someday you'll be free. Maybe not in this world, but someday." Mercy had thought her mother was speaking about the afterlife, about the Christian promise of eternal rest and peace. Now she wondered if Ruth had foreseen something else entirely, a different kind of freedom that could only be won through decisive action. The bread finished baking just as the sun disappeared behind the trees, its golden crust crackling softly as it cooled. Mercy removed the loaves from the oven and set them on the wooden counter, their surfaces perfect and unmarked by any sign of what lay within. The ham was ready as well, its glaze glistening in the lamplight, and the vegetables were tender and fragrant. It was, by any measure, a beautiful meal, one that would have satisfied the most discriminating palate under normal circumstances. But these were no longer normal circumstances, if indeed they ever had been. Mercy arranged everything on the serving platters with artistic precision, as if she were preparing dishes for a grand celebration rather than an execution. The ham went on the largest platter, surrounded by the glazed vegetables and garnished with fresh herbs from the garden. The bread she sliced thick and arranged in a basket lined with a clean white cloth, its warmth still radiating through the fabric. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as the Hathaway family would expect from their trusted cook. As she carried the food to the dining room, Mercy felt a strange sense of ceremony, as if she were participating in a ritual whose significance stretched far beyond this single evening. The dining room was illuminated by candles in silver holders, their light flickering across the polished mahogany table and reflecting off the crystal glasses. The family was already seated, Master Hathaway at the head of the table, Cordelia to his right, and the twins across from each other. They barely acknowledged her presence as she set the platters on the sideboard and began serving each course. This was how it had always been. The enslaved woman who prepared and served their food, rendered invisible by their assumption of superiority. They discussed their day as she moved around the table, filling their plates and replenishing their wine glasses, talking over her as if she were a piece of furniture rather than a human being. Master Hathaway was complaining about the falling price of cotton and the difficulty of finding buyers for the next harvest. Cordelia was planning a dinner party for the following week, discussing the menu and guest list with the casual assumption that Mercy would handle all the details. Charles and Robert were arguing about their plans for the weekend, debating whether to go hunting or spend the day fishing in the creek that ran through the property. It was all so ordinary, so routine, that Mercy almost felt as if she were watching a play rather than participating in reality. These people were discussing their future plans with complete confidence, never imagining that this might be their last conversation, that the woman serving their meal had already decided their fate. The disconnect between their assumptions and the truth of the situation created a surreal atmosphere that made everything feel dreamlike and distant. When she placed the basket of bread on the table, Master Hathaway immediately reached for a slice, as she had known he would. He always ate the bread first, claiming it was the mark of a good meal. Cordelia took a smaller piece, breaking it into delicate fragments that she nibbled between sips of wine. Charles and Robert each grabbed thick slices, their young appetites driving them to consume food with the enthusiasm of growing boys. Mercy watched from her position by the sideboard, her face a mask of professional servitude that revealed nothing of the turmoil within. The bread looked perfect, its golden crust giving way to the soft white interior, and the family consumed it with their usual appreciation. Master Hathaway complimented the flavor, as he often did, and Cordelia nodded her agreement. The twins devoured their portions and reached for more, their healthy young bodies processing the food with efficient hunger. For several minutes, nothing unusual happened. The family continued eating and talking, moving on to the ham and vegetables with their typical enthusiasm. Mercy began to wonder if her plan had failed, if the glass powder had been too fine to have any effect, or if she had not used enough to cause the damage she intended. Perhaps the bread had diluted the glass too much, or the cooking process had somehow neutralized its cutting power. But then Master Hathaway paused in his eating, a puzzled expression crossing his face. He touched his throat with one hand, as if something was irritating it, and took a sip of wine. The wine seemed to make the sensation worse, and he winced, his face beginning to redden. Across the table, Cordelia had stopped eating as well, her hand pressed to her mouth as she stared down at her plate with growing alarm. The twins were the first to cry out, their younger bodies reacting more quickly to the foreign substance in their systems. Charles dropped his fork and grabbed his throat, his eyes wide with pain and confusion. Robert doubled over in his chair, retching violently as blood began to appear at the corners of his mouth. The bright red droplets stood out starkly against the white tablecloth, spreading slowly across the fine fabric like blooming roses. Master Hathaway tried to stand, his chair scraping against the floor as he struggled to his feet, but his legs seemed unsteady, and he gripped the edge of the table for support. His throat was working convulsively, as if he were trying to swallow or speak, but only strangled sounds emerged. Blood was running down his chin now, staining his white shirt and vest with spreading crimson. Cordelia had begun to scream, a high, keening sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. She clawed at her throat with both hands, her delicate fingers leaving red scratches on the pale skin. The careful arrangement of her hair was coming undone, and her face was contorting with agony as the glass shards continued their deadly work inside her body. The scene that unfolded before Mercy was one of utter chaos and horror. The family that had controlled her life for nearly 3 decades was now writhing in agony, their bodies betrayed by the very sustenance they had taken for granted. The dining room that had been the scene of so many elegant meals was being transformed into something out of a nightmare, with blood spreading across the white tablecloth and the sounds of suffering echoing off the walls. But instead of feeling satisfaction or revenge, Mercy found herself experiencing a strange numbness as if she were watching events unfold from a great distance. The reality of what she had done was beginning to settle in. Not just the immediate physical consequences, but the broader implications for everyone on the plantation. She knew that once this night was discovered, every enslaved person would be suspect, and Crawford's investigations would be brutal and thorough. Master Hathaway had collapsed back into his chair, his breathing becoming increasingly labored. His face was ashen, except for the bright red blood that continued to flow from his mouth and nose. He was trying to speak, his lips moving soundlessly, but no words came. His eyes, those cold blue eyes that had looked through her for so many years, were now fixed on her face with an expression of confused accusation. Cordelia had fallen from her chair and was crawling across the floor, leaving a trail of blood behind her. Her elegant dinner dress was ruined, soaked with the evidence of her internal injuries. She was still making that terrible keening sound, though it was growing weaker as her strength ebbed away. The careful facade of Southern gentility that had defined her existence was completely stripped away, leaving only raw human suffering. Charles and Robert had both collapsed, their young bodies unable to cope with the massive internal trauma they were experiencing. Charles was still conscious, his eyes darting wildly around the room, as if looking for help that would never come. Robert had lost consciousness, his breathing shallow and irregular, blood pooling beneath his head where it had struck the floor. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room continued its steady ticking, marking the passage of time with mechanical indifference to the human tragedy unfolding before it. The candles continued to burn, their flames dancing in the disturbed air, casting shifting shadows across the scene of destruction. The beautiful meal that Mercy had prepared with such care lay forgotten on the table, the ham and vegetables growing cold as the family who would have consumed them fought for their lives. Mercy stood frozen in place for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching the consequences of her actions play out before her. The numbness she had felt was beginning to give way to a complex mixture of emotions that she couldn't fully process. There was no satisfaction in watching their suffering, no sense of justice served or wrongs righted. There was only the terrible knowledge that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Finally, as the sounds from the family began to weaken and fade, Mercy turned and walked toward the kitchen. Her legs felt unsteady, as if they belonged to someone else, but she forced herself to move with purpose. There were things she needed to do, preparations she needed to make for whatever came next. The numbness was being replaced by a cold clarity that allowed her to think practically about her situation. In the kitchen, she moved quickly and efficiently, gathering the few personal possessions she owned. There wasn't much, just a change of clothes, a small wooden cross her mother had carved for her, and a few other items that held sentimental value. Everything fit easily into a cloth bundle that she could carry without difficulty. She also took some food from the pantry, bread and cheese and dried meat that would sustain her for several days if necessary. As she prepared to leave, Mercy paused at the kitchen window and looked back toward the main house. The dining room windows glowed with warm candlelight, looking peaceful and inviting from the outside. No one passing by would guess at the horror that lay within those walls, the price that had finally been paid for decades of casual cruelty and dehumanization. She thought about the other enslaved people on the plantation, sleeping peacefully in their quarters, unaware that their world was about to change forever. When the bodies were discovered, there would be investigations, interrogations, and almost certainly punishment for the innocent, along with any who might be deemed guilty. The knowledge of what her actions would mean for them weighed heavily on her conscience, but she pushed the guilt aside. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with its consequences. The back door of the kitchen opened with its familiar creak, the same sound she had heard thousands of times over the years. But this time, instead of stepping outside to tend the garden or visit the smokehouse, she was walking away from the only life she had ever known. The September night was cool and clear, with stars visible through the canopy of trees that surrounded the plantation buildings. The air smelled of wood smoke and ripening apples, the familiar sense of home that she might never experience again. Mercy pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began walking toward the woods that bordered the plantation. She had no clear destination in mind, no plan beyond the immediate need to put distance between herself and the scene of her crime. The Underground Railroad was more myth than reality in this part of Alabama. and she had no contacts or safe houses to provide her with guidance or shelter. She would have to rely on her own resourcefulness and hope that luck would favor her flight. As she reached the edge of the trees, Mercy paused for one last look back at the plantation. The big house stood silhouetted against the night sky, its white columns gleaming faintly in the starlight. The kitchen building was dark now, the fire she had tended so faithfully finally allowed to burn out. The slave quarters were quiet, their inhabitants unaware that their lives had been irrevocably changed by the actions of one desperate woman. She thought about the story that would be told about this night in years to come, how it would be shaped by those who survived to tell it. Would she be remembered as a monster? A mad woman who had finally snapped under the pressure of her circumstances? Or would some understand the desperation that had driven her to such an extreme act? Would her story serve as a warning to other masters about the dangers of pushing their slaves too far? Or would it simply be used to justify even harsher treatment and tighter controls? The truth was that Mercy herself didn't know how to judge her own actions. The moral certainties that had guided her life for 28 years had been shattered along with the glass she had ground into the family's bread. She had become something she had never imagined she could be, someone capable of calculated murder, and the knowledge sat like a stone in her chest. But she had also become something else, something that might be even more significant. For the first time in her life, she had made a choice that was entirely her own, had taken action based on her own will rather than the demands of others. The cost had been terrible, but the transformation was real. She was no longer Mercy, the slave, the obedient cook, who kept her thoughts to herself and her head down. She was Mercy the fugitive, Mercy the avenger, Mercy the free woman who had paid for her freedom with blood. The woods closed around her as she began her journey into the unknown, the trees providing cover from any pursuit that might follow. Behind her, the plantation continued its deathly quiet, the bodies in the dining room growing cold as the candles burned lower. By morning, the discovery would be made, and the hunt would begin. But for now, in the darkness between her old life and whatever lay ahead, Mercy Allen was free. Her path through the forest was guided more by instinct than knowledge, following deer trails and creek beds that led generally northward. She had heard stories of slaves who had escaped to the north, though most of those tales ended in recapture and punishment. The distances were vast, the dangers numerous, and the chances of success slim. But she had already committed herself to this course, and turning back was no longer an option. As she walked, Mercy found herself thinking about the practical challenges that lay ahead. She would need to find food and shelter, to avoid the slave catchers and bloodhounds that would inevitably be set on her trail, to somehow make her way hundreds of miles through hostile territory to reach the free states. She had no money, no allies, no knowledge of the routes or safe havens that might help her along the way. All she had was her determination, and the terrible knowledge that capture would mean a death far worse than anything she had inflicted on the Hathaway family. The night was filled with sounds that seemed amplified by her heightened state of awareness. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig, every distant animal call could signal discovery and doom. She forced herself to move quietly, despite her urgent need for speed, knowing that caution might be the difference between escape and capture. The bundle of possessions on her back felt heavier with each step, but she couldn't afford to abandon anything that might prove useful in the days ahead. Hours passed as she made her way deeper into the wilderness, the plantation's lights long since disappeared behind her. The physical exertion was helping to clear her mind, focusing her thoughts on the immediate challenges of navigation and survival rather than the moral implications of what she had done. She was becoming someone new with each step, shedding the identity that had been imposed on her and creating something that belonged entirely to her. Dawn was beginning to break when Mercy finally allowed herself to rest, finding shelter in a dense thicket beside a small stream. The water was clear and cold, and she drank deeply before settling down to assess her situation. The bundle of food she had taken from the plantation would last perhaps 3 days if she was careful, and after that, she would need to forage or risk approaching settlements for supplies. The clothes she wore marked her as a slave, but she had no others that might help her blend in with free blacks or poor whites. As the sun rose higher and the sounds of birds filled the air, Mercy tried to plan her next moves. She knew she was probably still on Hathaway land, or that of his neighbors, all of whom would soon be aware of what had happened and on the lookout for any suspicious activity. Her best chance lay in moving only at night and staying hidden during the day, but that would make her journey much longer and increase the chances of being discovered. The stream beside her shelter ran roughly northward, and she decided to follow it when darkness fell again. Water would mask her scent from the dogs that were certainly being prepared to track her, and the creek bed would provide easier walking than the dense underbrush of the forest. It would also lead her away from the plantation and hopefully toward terrain where she might find help, or at least better concealment. Throughout the day, as she rested in her hiding place, Mercy found herself listening for sounds of pursuit. She imagined she could hear the baying of hounds in the distance, the shouting of men on horseback, the sound of her former world organizing itself to bring her back to face justice. But the forest remained peaceful, filled only with the natural sounds of insects and birds going about their daily business. As evening approached, and she prepared to continue her journey, Mercy realized that she was no longer the same person who had ground glass into bread just 24 hours earlier. The woman who had served the Hathaway family faithfully for 15 years was gone, replaced by someone harder and more calculating. She had discovered reserves of strength and ruthlessness that she hadn't known she possessed, qualities that might well mean the difference between freedom and death. When darkness fell, she emerged from her hiding place and began following the stream northward. The water was shallow enough to wade through in most places, and the sound of its flow would help mask any noise she made. The night was cloudy, which provided additional cover but made navigation more difficult. She could only trust that the creek would lead her in the right direction, and hope that dawn would find her farther from the plantation and closer to whatever destiny awaited her. For 3 more days and nights, Mercy followed this pattern, traveling by darkness and hiding during the day. The bundle of food she had taken was long gone, and she was surviving on berries and edible plants she remembered from her childhood, when her mother had taught her to identify what the forest could provide. Her clothes were torn and stained, her hands scratched and bleeding from pushing through thorny underbrush, but she pressed on with a determination born of desperation. On the 4th morning, as she searched for a place to hide during the day, Mercy heard the sound she had been dreading, the distant baying of hounds. The dogs had finally picked up her trail, probably at the creek where she had been careless about covering her tracks the night before. The sound was still far off, but it was moving steadily closer, accompanied by the shouting of men and the thunder of horses' hooves on the forest floor. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Mercy forced herself to think clearly. She was near the top of a ridge that overlooked a valley filled with dense forest and rocky outcroppings. If she could reach the rocks, she might be able to throw the dogs off her scent, but it would mean abandoning the relative safety of the creek bed and traveling over open ground where she could be easily spotted. The decision was made for her when the baying suddenly grew much louder, indicating that the pack had found the place where she had left the water. She had perhaps an hour before they reached her current position, maybe less if they were moving fast. Grabbing her meager possessions, Mercy began scrambling down the steep slope toward the valley below, using trees and bushes to keep from sliding on the loose soil and leaves. The descent was treacherous, and she slipped several times, scraping her knees and elbows on sharp rocks and thorny branches. But the sounds of pursuit were growing steadily closer, driving her forward despite the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her remaining strength. At the bottom of the slope, she plunged into the thickest part of the forest, where ancient oaks and maples created a canopy so dense that little sunlight reached the ground. Here, in the perpetual twilight of the deep woods, Mercy found what she was looking for. A jumble of massive boulders, probably deposited by some long-ago glacier, created a maze of caves and crevices that offered both concealment and multiple escape routes. She worked her way deep into the rock formation, following narrow passages that led to a small chamber barely large enough for her to lie down in. From her hiding place, she could hear the hunt getting closer. The dogs were baying almost continuously now, their excitement indicating that they were following a fresh trail. Men's voices echoed through the forest, calling out orders and coordinating their search. She recognized Crawford's harsh tones among them, along with voices she didn't know, probably slave catchers hired specially for this hunt. The sound of the pack reached the rocky area where she was hiding, and she could hear the dogs becoming confused as their scent scattered among the stones. Their baying became more sporadic and uncertain, and she heard Crawford cursing them and their handlers. The men dismounted and began searching on foot, their heavy boots clattering on the rocks as they explored every possible hiding place. For what felt like hours, the search continued all around her. At one point, she heard footsteps directly above her hiding place, so close that dirt and small pebbles rained down through cracks in the rock. She pressed herself against the stone wall and tried to breathe as quietly as possible, certain that discovery was imminent. But the searcher moved on, and gradually the sounds of the hunt began to recede as the party expanded their search to other areas. By late afternoon, the forest had returned to relative quiet. Mercy remained in her rocky sanctuary until well after dark, afraid that the hunters might have left someone behind to watch for her emergence. When she finally ventured out, the night was moonless and overcast, providing perfect cover for her continued flight. But she now knew that conventional escape was impossible. The hunters had dogs, horses, and local knowledge that gave them overwhelming advantages. They would continue the pursuit until she was caught, or until they found her body. Her only hope lay in somehow changing the terms of the hunt and becoming something other than a fleeing slave to be tracked down like an animal. The idea that came to her as she made her way through the darkness was born of desperation and the strange transformation she had undergone since leaving the plantation. If she could not escape the hunters, perhaps she could turn the hunt against them. The same ruthlessness that had enabled her to poison the Hathaway family might serve her again, but in a different way. Moving carefully through the forest, Mercy began to backtrack along her own trail, using skills her mother had taught her in childhood to move silently through the underbrush. She knew the hunters would likely make camp for the night rather than continue their search in the darkness, and she was betting that their confidence in their superior numbers and equipment would make them careless about their own security. She found their camp just before dawn, a clearing beside a stream where they had built a large fire and picketed their horses. There were 6 men, plus Crawford, along with a pack of bloodhounds that lay sleeping near the fire. The men had posted no sentries, apparently believing that a lone woman posed no threat to armed and experienced hunters. From her concealment at the edge of the clearing, Mercy studied the camp layout and began to formulate a plan. The horses were the key to their mobility, and without them, the hunters would be reduced to traveling on foot like herself. But simply scattering the animals would not be enough. She needed to do something that would end the pursuit permanently. The solution came to her as she watched Crawford tending the fire, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing flames. This man had terrorized the enslaved population of the Hathaway plantation for 5 years, had separated families, and inflicted countless beatings with his leather whip. He was the instrument of oppression that had made her life unbearable, and now he was leading the hunt that would surely end in her capture and death. But Crawford was also the leader of this expedition, the man whose knowledge and determination drove the pursuit. Without him, the others might well abandon the hunt and return to report that she had vanished into the wilderness. And unlike the Hathaway family, who had been guilty mainly of callous indifference, Crawford had actively chosen cruelty as his profession. As dawn approached, Mercy began to move around the perimeter of the camp, staying well within the concealment of the forest, but positioning herself for what she planned to do. The men were beginning to stir, preparing to break camp and resume their search. Crawford was already awake, checking his weapons and issuing quiet orders to the others. The moment came when Crawford walked alone to the stream to fill his water bottle, moving just far enough from the camp to be temporarily isolated. Mercy had found a sturdy piece of dead wood, about the size of a club, and she gripped it tightly as she crept through the underbrush toward the water's edge. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was clear and focused on what had to be done. Crawford was kneeling beside the stream, his back to the forest, when Mercy stepped out of the shadows behind him. He must have heard something, because he started to turn, his hand reaching for the pistol at his belt. But she was already in motion, bringing the club down on his skull with all the strength she could muster. The impact made a sound like a melon being dropped, and Crawford collapsed face first into the shallow water. Mercy stood over him for a moment, watching blood spread through the clear stream, before grabbing his weapons and ammunition pouch. She had perhaps a few minutes before the other men would notice his absence and come looking for him. Moving quickly, she untied the horses and drove them away from the camp with sharp slaps and shouted commands. The animals scattered in different directions, their training making them flee from the unfamiliar voice and aggressive gestures. Some would probably return to their home stables eventually, but others would wander for days before being recovered, if they were recovered at all. By the time the remaining hunters discovered Crawford's body and realized what had happened, Mercy was already miles away, armed now with his rifle and pistol. The psychological impact of her attack would be at least as important as its practical effects. These men had been hunting what they thought was a desperate but helpless fugitive, and suddenly they found themselves being stalked by someone who had demonstrated both the capability and willingness to kill. The dynamics of the hunt had changed completely. Instead of confidently pursuing a fleeing victim, the remaining hunters now had to consider the possibility that they themselves were in danger. Without horses, they would have to continue on foot, and without Crawford's leadership and local knowledge, their chances of success were greatly diminished. News of Crawford's death and the horse's disappearance would spread quickly through the surrounding area, carried by the surviving hunters when they returned to report their failure. The story would grow in the telling, as such stories always did, transforming Mercy from a desperate fugitive into something far more threatening. She had become not just an escaped slave, but a killer who struck from the shadows, someone to be feared rather than merely pursued. This transformation served her purposes perfectly. Over the following weeks, as she continued her northward flight, Mercy found that her reputation had preceded her. Isolated farmhouses were more heavily guarded, travelers moved in larger groups, and slave patrols operated with increased caution. The fear she had inspired was creating a protective buffer around her, as people preferred to avoid confronting someone who had proven so dangerous. But the reputation came with its own risks. The authorities had placed a substantial bounty on her capture, dead or alive, and professional bounty hunters from across the South had taken up the pursuit. These men were more experienced and better equipped than the plantation owners and overseers who had initially given chase, and they operated with a cold professionalism that made them far more dangerous. Mercy adapted to these new circumstances by becoming even more elusive and unpredictable. She avoided main roads and settlements, traveling primarily through wilderness areas where her tracking skills gave her an advantage over her urban pursuers. She learned to live off the land completely, identifying edible plants and setting snares for small game. The comfortable life she had known in the plantation kitchen was replaced by a harsh existence that tested every survival skill she possessed. Winter was approaching as she continued her flight northward, and the changing weather presented new challenges. The leaves were falling from the trees, reducing the concealment provided by the forest, and the approaching cold weather would make sleeping outdoors increasingly difficult. She needed to find some form of shelter where she could wait out the worst of the winter months, somewhere remote enough to avoid detection, but accessible enough to allow her to continue her journey when spring returned. The solution came in the form of an abandoned cabin she discovered deep in the mountains of northern Alabama. The structure was old and partially collapsed, probably built by some long-ago settler who had given up on wresting a living from the rocky soil. But the walls were still mostly sound, and with some work, she was able to make it weatherproof enough to provide basic shelter. Here, in the isolation of the mountains, Mercy spent the winter months of 1847 and 48. She had enough ammunition for Crawford's rifle to hunt small game, and she supplemented this protein with stored nuts and roots she gathered before the ground froze. It was a lonely and sometimes desperate existence, but it was also the first time in her adult life that she had lived entirely by her own choices and efforts. During the long winter nights, as wind howled around her crude shelter, Mercy found herself reflecting on the path that had brought her to this place. The woman who had ground glass into bread and walked away from the dying Hathaway family seemed like a different person now, someone she could barely recognize. The transformation that had begun in the plantation kitchen had continued through months of flight and hardship, creating someone entirely new. She had become a creature of the wilderness, as comfortable moving through dark forests as she had once been in a well-appointed kitchen. Her hands, once soft from domestic work, were now hard and scarred from handling weapons and surviving in the wild. Her face had been weathered by exposure to wind and sun, and her body had been toughened by constant physical demands. But more importantly, her mind had been changed by the experience of complete freedom and complete responsibility for her own survival. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, Mercy was ready to resume her journey northward. She had used the winter months to plan her route more carefully, studying the lay of the land and identifying the safest passages through the remaining hundreds of miles that lay between her and the Free States. The bounty hunters were probably still searching for her, but months of inactivity might have reduced their numbers or caused them to shift their attention to more recent fugitives. Her reputation had continued to grow during her absence from the active pursuit. Stories of the slave woman who had poisoned her master's family and killed the overseer who hunted her had spread throughout the South, inspiring both fear and a kind of grudging admiration. Some of these stories bore little resemblance to the truth, describing her as everything from a conjure woman with supernatural powers to a trained assassin sent by Northern abolitionists. But all of them contributed to the legend that was forming around her name. This legend served her well as she resumed her travels. Word of her approach often preceded her, causing potential pursuers to think twice about engaging someone with such a fearsome reputation. Local slave patrols became more cautious, and individual bounty hunters were less likely to attempt solo captures. The fear she had initially created through necessity had become a tool that helped ensure her continued survival. But the legend also brought new dangers. Federal authorities had become involved in her case, viewing her not just as an escaped slave, but as a symbol of potential rebellion that needed to be stopped. Professional manhunters with national reputations had taken up the pursuit, drawn by the substantial bounty and the fame that would come from capturing someone who had become a household name throughout the South. As spring turned to summer, Mercy found herself playing an increasingly complex game of cat and mouse, with multiple groups of pursuers. She learned to identify the different types of hunters by their methods and equipment, adapting her evasion tactics to counter each approach. The inexperienced locals could be avoided through simple stealth and misdirection, but the professionals required more sophisticated countermeasures. Her greatest advantage remained her intimate knowledge of survival in the wilderness. While her pursuers had to carry supplies and maintain some connection to civilization, she could live entirely off the land for extended periods. This allowed her to travel through areas where others could not follow, using routes that would be impossible for anyone less skilled in woodcraft. By midsummer, she had crossed into Tennessee, though the exact location of state boundaries meant little to someone traveling through unmarked wilderness. The terrain was becoming more familiar as she moved into regions she had heard described by other slaves who had attempted escape. She was still hundreds of miles from safety, but for the first time since leaving the plantation, she began to believe that freedom might actually be attainable. The final phase of her journey would prove to be the most dangerous. As she approached the areas where the Underground Railroad operated, the network of informants and bounty hunters became denser and more sophisticated. These were men who specialized in capturing fugitives, just short of safety, who knew all the routes and safe houses that others might use. They operated with a cruel efficiency that came from years of experience in human hunting. But Mercy had advantages that most fugitives lacked. Her reputation meant that few were willing to approach her directly, preferring to maintain surveillance from a distance while calling for reinforcements. Her wilderness skills allowed her to detect and avoid most surveillance attempts. And her willingness to fight, proven through months of successful evasion, gave her options that more passive fugitives did not possess. The confrontation that would determine her ultimate fate came in late summer, near the border between Tennessee and Kentucky. She had been traveling along a ridge that paralleled the main road, using the elevation to observe traffic while remaining concealed in the forest. The road below showed signs of unusual activity, with riders moving back and forth in patterns that suggested coordinated searching rather than normal travel. From her concealment, Mercy could see that a trap was being prepared. Multiple groups of armed men were positioning themselves along the route she had been following, creating a net that would be virtually impossible to avoid. Someone had predicted her movements with remarkable accuracy, probably using information from previous sightings to calculate her most likely path. The trap was sophisticated and professionally executed, the work of experienced manhunters who understood their prey. But it was also static, depending on her following a predictable route into their prepared positions. If she could somehow break the pattern they expected, she might still have a chance to escape their net. The solution required her to abandon everything she had learned about safe travel and do something completely unexpected. Instead of avoiding the main road as she had throughout her journey, she would use it. The hunters were positioned to intercept someone moving through the forest parallel to the road, not someone bold enough to travel openly on the road itself. Waiting until darkness provided some concealment, Mercy made her way down from the ridge to the road below. The surface was hard-packed dirt and gravel, much easier to travel than the rough terrain she had been navigating for months. More importantly, it led directly toward her destination, cutting through the mountains by the most efficient route possible. The risk was enormous. If she encountered any of the searchers, there would be nowhere to hide and no possibility of escape. But the very boldness of the maneuver might catch them off guard, allowing her to pass through their net before they realized what was happening. For several miles, the gamble seemed to be working. The road was empty except for her own footsteps, and she made better time than she had in weeks. The hunters were probably still maintaining their positions in the forest, waiting for a target that would never appear where they expected. But her luck ran out just before dawn, when she encountered a group of riders coming toward her from the direction she was traveling. There was no time to leave the road, and nowhere to hide in the relatively open terrain. She could only continue walking, and hope that darkness and distance would prevent them from immediately identifying her. The riders approached at a steady pace, their horses' hooves echoing off the surrounding hills. As they drew closer, Mercy could see that there were 4 of them, all armed and alert. These were not casual travelers, but men with purpose, probably part of the network that had been hunting her for so many months. When they were close enough to speak, the lead rider called out to her. "You there, woman, stop where you are and identify yourself." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and his hand rested casually on the pistol at his belt. Mercy stopped walking, but did not reply immediately. In the growing light of dawn, she could see the faces of the men clearly, and she recognized the cold professionalism of experienced bounty hunters. These were not local farmers or plantation owners, but specialists who made their living from human capture. "I said identify yourself," the leader repeated, his voice harder now. "State your name and your business on this road." Instead of answering, Mercy slowly reached into her clothing and withdrew Crawford's pistol. The weapon was loaded and ready, as it had been throughout her long journey. Her hand was steady as she raised it, and her voice was calm when she finally spoke. "My name is Mercy Allen," she said, "and my business is freedom." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge, and for a moment, nobody moved. The bounty hunters recognized the name, of course, and they understood what it meant to be facing the woman whose reputation had spread throughout the South. But they also understood the size of the bounty that would be theirs, if they could take her alive. The standoff lasted only seconds before violence erupted. The lead rider went for his weapon, and Mercy fired without hesitation. The pistol's report echoed off the hills like thunder, and the man tumbled from his horse with a scream of pain and rage. The other riders scattered, seeking cover behind their mounts, while drawing their own weapons. What followed was a running battle that lasted for nearly an hour, with Mercy using every advantage the terrain provided to avoid the superior firepower of her opponents. She had Crawford's rifle in addition to the pistol, and she used both weapons with a skill that surprised even herself. The months of living by hunting had made her an excellent marksman, and the desperation of her situation gave her the ruthlessness necessary to kill without hesitation. When the battle was over, 3 of the 4 bounty hunters lay dead on the road, and the 4th was badly wounded, but still alive. Mercy approached him cautiously, her rifle ready in case he tried to reach for a weapon. The man was young, probably not much older than herself, and his face was pale with pain and shock. "Please," he whispered, as she stood over him. "Don't kill me. I have a family, children who need me." Mercy studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that reminded her of the humanity she had nearly forgotten during her long flight. This man was not Crawford or Master Hathaway, not someone who had chosen cruelty as a way of life. He was probably just someone trying to make a living in the only way available to him, someone who had gotten involved in something larger and more dangerous than he understood. "Go home," she said finally, lowering her rifle. "Go home to your family and find another way to make your living. Forget you ever saw me." The wounded man nodded frantically, struggling to sit up despite his injuries. "Yes, ma'am, I will. I swear I will." Mercy gathered ammunition from the dead men and took one of their horses, a strong bay mare that would carry her much faster than she could travel on foot. As she prepared to leave, she looked back at the wounded bounty hunter one last time. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them that Mercy Allen is still free. Tell them she's going home." With that, she mounted the horse and continued northward, leaving the scene of battle behind her. The road stretched ahead into the rising sun, leading toward a destination she could only imagine but was determined to reach. Behind her, the wounded man struggled to his feet and began the long walk back to report what had happened. The story of the battle on the mountain road spread even faster than her previous exploits, carried by the surviving bounty hunter and amplified by the discovery of the bodies. Mercy Allen had become more than just a fugitive slave. She had become a symbol of resistance that inspired both terror and admiration throughout the South. The authorities increased the bounty on her head to unprecedented levels, but fewer and fewer people were willing to attempt her capture. Through the remaining months of 1848, she continued her northward flight with a new sense of purpose and possibility. The stolen horse allowed her to travel much faster, and her growing reputation served as a shield against most potential pursuers. She began to encounter people, both enslaved and free, who had heard her story and were willing to provide assistance or at least safe passage through their territories. By late autumn, she had crossed into Kentucky, where the Underground Railroad operated more openly and effectively. Here, for the first time since leaving the plantation, she found people who were actively working to help fugitive slaves reach freedom. The network of safe houses, guides, and sympathizers provided resources and routes that made the final phase of her journey much safer and more hopeful. But even with this assistance, the last miles proved challenging. Federal authorities had increased their efforts to intercept fugitive slaves, and the border regions between slave and free states were heavily patrolled. Mercy's reputation made her a particular target, and special efforts were being made to prevent her from completing her journey to freedom. The final crossing came on a cold night in December 1848, more than a year after she had walked out of the Hathaway plantation kitchen. She stood on the banks of the Ohio River, looking across the dark water toward the lights of Cincinnati on the opposite shore. Somewhere beyond those lights lay true freedom, the chance to live as a human being rather than as property or a hunted fugitive. The crossing itself was accomplished with the help of Underground Railroad conductors who had made the dangerous journey countless times before. They used a small boat to ferry fugitives across the river under cover of darkness, timing their trips to avoid the patrol boats that watched for escaped slaves. For Mercy, the short boat ride represented the end of the longest year of her life and the beginning of something entirely new. As the boat touched the Ohio shore and she stepped onto free soil for the first time in her life, Mercy felt a transformation that went even deeper than the changes she had undergone during her long flight. She was no longer a slave, no longer a fugitive, no longer defined by what she was running from. She was a free woman, with all the rights and responsibilities that freedom entailed. The Underground Railroad conductors helped her establish a new identity and find work in Cincinnati, where a substantial population of free blacks and sympathetic whites provided both community and protection. She took the name Mary Freeman, symbolically claiming both her new identity and her hard-won status. The skill she had learned in the plantation kitchen served her well in her new life, and she found work as a cook in a restaurant that catered to the city's growing middle class. For several years, she lived quietly in Cincinnati, sending money when possible to Underground Railroad operations and occasionally providing safe haven for other fugitives making the same journey she had completed. She never married or had children, perhaps because the trauma of her experiences had made normal relationships impossible, or perhaps because she feared that emotional attachments might make her vulnerable to those who still sought to reclaim her. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 brought new dangers even to the free states, as federal agents were empowered to capture escaped slaves anywhere in the country and return them to bondage. Many free blacks, including some who had never been enslaved, were kidnapped and sold into slavery under the provisions of this law. For someone with Mercy's history, and the substantial bounty that still existed for her capture, the risk was particularly acute. Rather than live in constant fear of recapture, she made the decision to continue her journey northward to Canada, where British law provided absolute protection for escaped slaves. The journey from Cincinnati to the Canadian border was much shorter and safer than her original flight from Alabama, but it still required careful planning and the assistance of Underground Railroad operatives. In the spring of 1851, Mercy Allen, now known as Mary Freeman, crossed from Detroit into Windsor, Ontario, completing a journey that had taken nearly 4 years and cost dozens of lives. Here, finally, she found the complete freedom that had driven her to grind glass into bread and walk away from everything she had ever known. She settled in a small farming community outside Toronto, where her reputation as an excellent cook helped her establish a successful catering business. The skills that had once been used to serve the family that enslaved her now provided her with independence and prosperity. She became active in the community of escaped slaves, helping newcomers establish themselves and providing financial support for Underground Railroad operations. But she never forgot the price that had been paid for her freedom, both by herself and by others. The Hathaway family had died horribly because she had chosen to fight back against her oppression. Crawford had been killed because he had chosen to hunt her like an animal. 3 bounty hunters had died on a mountain road because they had tried to capture her for money. The cost of her freedom had been measured in blood, and that knowledge stayed with her for the rest of her life. In her later years, as the American Civil War brought an end to slavery and the Underground Railroad became a part of history, Mercy began to speak publicly about her experiences. She became one of the most powerful voices for the abolition movement in Canada, using her story to illustrate both the horrors of slavery and the lengths to which people would go to achieve freedom. She died in Toronto in 1889, at the age of 70, having lived more than 40 years as a free woman. Her death was noted in newspapers throughout Canada and the northern United States, where she had become a symbol of resistance and determination. The obituaries described her as a woman who had paid the ultimate price for freedom and had used that freedom to help others escape the bonds of slavery. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to her memory was the continued telling of her story, passed down through generations of people who understood the courage required to risk everything for the chance to live as a human being. The woman who had walked out of a plantation kitchen into the Alabama night had become a legend, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals could choose to fight back against injustice and oppression. The glass that she had ground into bread had served its purpose, providing the catalyst for a transformation that changed not only her own life, but also inspired countless others to seek their own freedom. In the end, Mercy Allen had achieved something far more significant than mere escape from slavery. She had demonstrated that the human spirit could never be completely enslaved, that there would always be those willing to pay any price for the chance to live free. Her story spread throughout the South in the years following her escape, told in whispered conversations among enslaved people who drew hope from her example. It became a cautionary tale for slave owners, a reminder that their control was not absolute, and that even the most seemingly docile servant might harbor thoughts of rebellion. And it became a symbol for abolitionists, proof that slavery was a system so fundamentally evil that it could drive decent people to desperate measures. The legend of Mercy Allen, the slave woman who mixed glass into supper and left her master's family bleeding out, lived on long after her death. It served as a reminder of the terrible costs of human bondage and the extraordinary measures that people would take to achieve freedom. In a world where millions lived in chains, her story offered proof that the chains could be broken, that freedom was possible for those willing to pay its price. And so her name passed into history, not as a villain or a victim, but as someone who had chosen to take control of her own destiny, regardless of the consequences. She had ground glass into bread, watched her oppressors die, killed those who hunted her, and walked thousands of miles through hostile territory to claim her freedom. She had become exactly what she had needed to become, and in doing so, had shown others what was possible when human beings refused to accept their circumstances as permanent. The plantation where it all began was eventually sold and divided among several owners, the grand house falling into disrepair as the economic system that had supported it crumbled. The kitchen where Mercy had prepared her final meal for the Hathaway family became a ruin, overgrown with vines and slowly returning to the earth. But the story of what had happened there lived on, a testament to the power of individual action to change the course of history. In the end, Mercy Allen had achieved something that few people, slave or free, could claim. She had lived entirely on her own terms, made her own choices, and paid her own prices. She had refused to be defined by others' expectations or limitations, and in doing so, had created a legacy that inspired generations of people seeking their own paths to freedom. The glass had done its work, the family had bled out on their white tablecloth, and the woman who had served them faithfully for 15 years had walked away into the night and into legend. It was a story of horror and heroism, of desperation and determination, of the terrible costs of freedom and the even more terrible costs of its absence. And it was, above all, the story of one woman who had decided that anything, even damnation itself, was preferable to remaining a slave.